The final problem continued. It was the last that I was ever destined to see him in this world. When I was near the bottom of the descent, I looked back. It was impossible from that position to see the fall, but I could see the curving path which winds over the shoulder of the hill and leads to it. Along this, a man was, I remember, walking very rapidly. I could see his black figure clearly outlined against the green behind him. I noted him and the energy with which he walked, but he passed from my mind again as I hurried on upon my errand. It may have been a little over an hour before I reached Meringen. Old Styler was standing at the porch of his hotel. "Well," said I, as I came hurrying up, "I trust that she is no worse." A look of surprise passed over his face, and at the first quiver of his eyebrows, my heart turned to lead in my breast. "You did not write this," I said, pulling the letter from my pocket. "There is no sick Englishwoman at the hotel." "Certainly not," he cried, "but it has the hotel mark upon it. Ha, it must have been written by that tall Englishman who came in after you had gone," he said, but I waited for none of the landlord's explanations. In a tingle of fear, I was already running down the village street and making for the path which I had so lately descended. It had taken me an hour to come down. For all my efforts, 2 more had passed before I found myself at the fall of Reichenbach once more. There was Holmes' Alpine stock still leaning against the rock by which I had left him. But there was no sign of him, and it was in vain that I shouted. My only answer was my own voice reverberating in a rolling echo from the cliffs around me. It was the sight of that Alpine stock which turned me cold and sick. He had not gone to Rosenlaui then. He had remained on that 3-foot path with sheer wall on one side and sheer drop upon the other until his enemy had overtaken him. The young Swiss had gone too. He had probably been in the pay of Moriarty and had left the 2 men together. And then what had happened? Who was to tell us what happened then? I stood for a minute or 2 to collect myself, for I was dazed with the horror of the thing. Then I began to think of Holmes' own methods and to try to practice them in reading this tragedy. It was, alas, only too easy to do. During our conversation, we had not gone to the end of the path, and the Alpine stock marked the place where we had stood. The blackish soil is kept forever soft by the incessant drift of spray, and a bird would leave its tread upon it. 2 lines of footmarks were clearly marked along the further end of the path, both leading away from me. There was none returning. A few yards from the end of the soil was all plowed up into a patch of mud, and the brambles and ferns which fringed the chasm were torn and bedraggled. I lay upon my face and peered over with the spray spouting up all around me. It had darkened since I left, and now I could see only here and there the glistening of moisture upon the black walls, and far away down at the end of the shaft the gleam of the broken water. I shouted, but only that same half-human cry of the fall was borne back to my ears. But it was destined that I should, after all, have a last word of greeting from my friend and comrade. I have said that this Alpine stock had been left leaning against a rock which jutted onto the path. From the top of this boulder, the gleam of something bright caught my eye, and raising my hand, I found that it came from the silver cigarette case which he used to carry. As I took it up, a small square of paper upon which it had lain fluttered down to the ground. Unfolding it, I found that it consisted of 3 pages torn from a notebook and addressed to me. It was characteristic of the man that the direction was as precise and the writing as firm as clear as though it had been written in his study. "My dear Watson," he said, "I write these few lines through the courtesy of Mr. Moriarty, who awaits my convenience for the final discussion of these questions which lie between us. He has been giving me a sketch of the methods by which he avoided the English police and kept himself informed of our movements. They certainly confirm the very high opinion which I had formed of his abilities. I am pleased to think that I shall be able to free society from any further effects of his presence, and from any further effects, though I fear that it is at a cost which will give pain to my friends, and especially my dear Watson. To you I have already explained to you, however, that my career had in any case reached its crisis, and that no possible conclusion to it could be more congenial to me than this. Indeed, if I may make a full confession to you, I was quite convinced that the letter from Meringen was a hoax, and I allowed you to depart on that errand under the persuasion that some development of this sort would follow. Tell Inspector Patterson that the papers which he needs to convict the gang are in Pigeonhole M, done up in a blue envelope and inscribed Moriarty. I made every disposition of my property before leaving England and handed it to my brother Mycroft. Pray give my greetings to Mrs. Watson and believe me to be, my dear fellow, very sincerely yours, Sherlock Holmes. A few words may suffice to tell the little that remains. An examination by experts leaves little doubt that a personal contest between the 2 men ended, and as it could hardly fail to end in such a situation, in their reeling over locked in each other's arms. Any attempt at recovering the bodies was absolutely hopeless, and there deep down in the dread cauldron of swirling water and seething foam will lie for all time the most dangerous criminal and the foremost champion of the law of their generation. The Swiss youth was never found again, and there can be no doubt that he was one of the numerous agents from Moriarty who Moriarty kept in his employ. As to the gang, it will be within the memory of the public how completely the evidence which Holmes had accumulated exposed their organization and how heavily the hand of the dead man weighed upon them. Of their terrible chief, few details came out during the proceedings, and if I have now been compelled to make a clear statement of his career, it is due to those injurious champions who have endeavored to clear his memory by attacks upon him, whom I shall ever regard as the best and the wisest man whom I have ever known.